We're going to have Dr. Bill Gray present the Performance 2 trial with 2-year outcomes.
Thank you very much. So we all know that microembolization during carotid stenting typically occurs during post-ballooning, which has been demonstrated both with TCD and other empiric data as the highest risk component of the procedure. Accordingly, the integrated embolic protection system, in this case embodied by the Paladin device, a balloon with a temporarily deployable filter, was developed to address that post-stent ballooning. It's a filter which is integrated on the delivery catheter. It has 40 micron pores, which is contradistinction to the typical 100 to 120 micron pores of our typical distal filter embolic protection devices. The filter can be deployed from the handle remotely, assures apposition to the wall, and can be adjusted to custom fit the anatomy of the particular patient. What we see when we captured material in prior studies of this device, the material captured in the filter actually is returned in 90% of the cases with particulate less than 100 microns, which means that the devices we currently use are probably providing incomplete or no protection for those majority of embolic material liberated. Microembolic signals, if you will, are picked up in DWI MRI as a mechanistic correlate to stroke and minor stroke especially. And we can see for endarterectomy, really as the gold standard, there's less than 20% new DWI lesions typically seen. TCAR has demonstrated similar effectiveness in reducing DWI lesions, and integrated embolic protection system, which I just described, also is in the 20% range. That's in the incidence of new lesions. If we look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that the mean lesion volume, which is probably the most relevant for the patient, is the lowest with integrated embolic protection, and certainly in keeping with the other device and surgical categories listed. So based on the experience with the balloon and filter system, an integrated 3-way system was developed, which has a purpose-built carotid stent, a balloon under the stent, and the same remotely deployed 40-micron filter. There were excellent results in 1 year in the Performance 1 and 2 data sets. And as we've already talked about, we've seen improvements in DWI abnormalities. Not only does the filter provide, the double filtration provide extra embolic protection, but the entire system is a much more streamlined system without the need for exchanges, and has a short landing zone which accommodates almost all anatomies. The closed cell stent is novel in that it's very flexible. It has a differentiated asymmetric hourglass design, and the cell sizes and distribution are also specifically tuned to carotid lesions. We've seen in prior study with the Performance 1 data set, the lowest rates of stroke in small data of 67 patients, and in the Performance 2 data set with over 300 patients, the 30-day data, very low rates of complication at 1.3%, intention to treat major and minor stroke, all of which, by the way, were minor strokes. There were no major strokes in any of these studies. The Performance 1 final study results of the 67 patients in Europe, no stroke seen in any of the patients at 30 days or at 12 months, demonstrating both safety of the protection system and robustness of the stent. There were no neurologic deaths and no major strokes throughout the course of this study. The Performance 2 trial design was to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of this NeuroGuard integrated embolic protection system in patients at high risk for endarterectomy. I was privileged to be the principal investigator with Rolf Langhoff in Europe. 305 subjects in 32 US and EU sites, symptomatic 50% lesion set or 80% asymptomatic lesion set, and had to have a criterion for high-risk endarterectomy. Primary endpoint is typical for carotid studies, which is the 30-day rate of all stroke, death, and myocardial infarction, plus 31 days to 365 days ipsilateral stroke. Subjects were followed for 3 years, and carotid duplex and neurologic exam out to that time period. The secondary endpoints include clinically driven TLR, in-stent restenosis, all of which through 36 months, major and minor stroke differentiation through 30 days, and neurologic death out to 12 months. The design was that everybody had to have a mandatory commercially available embolic protection device, and dual antiplatelet therapy was required only for 30 days and then per site practice. The conduct of the study included a screening committee which was meant to enforce the established inclusion and exclusion criteria. Any potential patient had a CT submitted to the adjudication committee, and they made sure that the inclusion and exclusion were met. Independent DSMB and CEC, and independent imaging analysis by Yale with 100% source data verification. So here are the patient characteristics. 20% of the patients by FDA mandate had to be symptomatic, and they were. The anatomic high-risk features were present in 25% of the patients, again, a FDA mandate, and the physiologic high risk in 75% with a mix of both in over 25% of the patients. Most patient lesion sets were de novo. The pre-stent stenosis severity was 85%, post-stent was less than 10%. There was no lesions, lesion thrombosis, lesion length was under 20 millimeters. And although lesion calcification the severe lesion calcification was an exclusion, nevertheless we saw severe calcification over a third of the patients. Here are the Performance 2 procedural characteristics. Radial access was in less than 10% of the patients, with majority in femoral access. Sheath sizes ranged from 6 and 7 French, primarily 7 French. And the dominant distal embolic protection system was the EmboShield in over 80% of the patients. Predilation was performed in about 60% of the patients before the NeuroGuard was delivered, and procedural success approached 97%. So here are the 30-day outcomes. These have been previously presented. Intention to treat analysis had 4 strokes, all minor, no major strokes. Per protocol, 3 strokes, and for a total of 1%. In asymptomatic patients, it was less than 1% at 0.8%, no contralateral strokes, 2 myocardial infarction, 1 death that occurred after the 30-day follow-up at 25 days was included anyway, not related to device or procedure. And for a total 30-day death, stroke, and MI rate of 2.3%, intention to treat, and 2.1% per protocol. The 1-year outcomes presented here last year showed that the primary endpoint of death, stroke, and MI to 30 days and ipsilateral stroke to 1 year was 2.8%, with 1 additional minor stroke occurring around 6 months in a patient with a patent stent and a critical illness thought to be the cause of his neurologic event. By the way, all the minor strokes that occurred had resolution within 30 days. There were no residual effects, and there were no major strokes at any time during this trial. No neurologic deaths. And target lesion revascularization occurred in about 1% of the patients. In-stent restenosis occurred in about 3.5% of the population, but clinically driven TLR, that is 80% or more by angiography, occurred in none of the patients. Here are the 2-year outcomes. No neurologic deaths, no stent thrombosis. Clinically driven TLR occurred in one patient in 2 years. Target lesion revascularization occurred in 7 patients in the first 2 years, and in-stent restenosis held steady at around 3.5% to 4%. Here's an example of a stent procedure. You can see the pre- and post-procedural angiography on the left with a nice result using a 9 by 7 by 8 by 40 NeuroGuard stent. And here is the patency duplex at 1 year, looking at the stent under duplex evaluation. So the next steps for this system are that the Performance 3 study is underway, which will evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the same system with direct carotid access and TCAR. A 70-centimeter shorty stent system has been developed for the access kit. Then the NeuroGuard and integrated embolic technology will also be assessed in the setting of acute stroke for treating tandem lesions. So in summary, the added safety in the most critical procedural carotid stent phase remains important even at 2 years with clinically driven TLR of less than 0.5%. in-stent restenosis of 3.5% to 4%, no stent thrombosis, no major strokes, and no neurologic deaths. The 30-day and 1-year data in Performance 2 were the lowest 1-year event rates for any adequately powered prospective multicenter trial for carotid vascularization, regardless of patient risk, and this is a high-risk trial. The NeuroGuard stent system continues to demonstrate durability, safety, and effectiveness at 2 years, despite a 43% rate of diabetes and more than a third of the patients with severe calcification. Thank you very much.
Fantastic presentation, Bill. Very impressive long-term results. What do you think accounts for the durability that we're seeing and how much the events really have improved over the course of the last few years?
Well, to answer the last part of your question first, I think the safety profile here is really owing to the dual filtration and the 40-micron proximal filter. I think there's little argument that when you look at the mechanistic data that's been developed on the DW-MRI as well as the microembolic material captured, it's hard to argue that that's not meaningful in the clinical, that the clinical outcome there is probably affected by that. In terms of long-term outcome, this is very robust stent data, and I think it's, it's a very, in my opinion, the best stent on the market. As I said, it's purpose-built. It's at least kind of 2.5 generation stent with a closed cell but flexibility that allows for tortuous anatomy as needed.
Bill, great results.
Thanks.
Congrats. Question about ISR. How did you define it? And I think you saw it in 10 out of the 24 in the intention to treat analysis. Tell us what you learned from that. And the second question is, was there any difference from first year to second year? I didn't catch that. In
the ISR? There wasn't much difference. It was 3.5% to 3.9%. I think it was one extra event. So, and the core lab has a criterion they use for a duplex evaluation of ISR and stented vessels. So we use that criterion.
None of them needed any repeat intervention. Right?
So there was one clinically driven TLR at 2 years. There was none at 1 year. There was TLR performed, but it didn't rise to the threshold of clinically driven, which had to be an 80% lesion or more.
Thanks.
Yep.
Congratulations on the study.
Hey, June, how are you?
Quick question. So the implications of clinical stroke versus DW-MRI findings, how do you implement that in your practice? Are we getting DW-MRI findings in everybody?
No.
Clearly we're not.
So I think, to be clear, DW-MRI is a investigational tool, I think, to look at embolic burden during any procedure. We're using it not just in carotid stenting, we use it in TAVR embolic protection as well, as you probably well know. So the idea is it's a mechanistic correlate to what we probably are seeing in the clinical side. And it's a default, because if we're going to look at clinical outcomes in carotid stenting with some improvement or maneuver we're hoping that will make the procedure safer or better, you have to randomize thousands of patients to see that. So I think when you see a reduction in mechanistic DWI abnormalities and lower rates of clinical events, I think that they tie together very nicely.
Being a thought leader in the carotid space, do you think that this should be an obligate endpoint or at least a secondary endpoint in all studies involving carotid intervention?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. No, I don't. I think we've all been bit by some of the TAVR microembolic DWI endpoints. There's a lot of breadth in the confidence interval and a lot of variability, and it's difficult whether you're talking about new lesions or volume of lesions. It gets to be pretty muddy pretty quickly. Even with about 400 or 500 patients in the Sentinel study, they weren't able to demonstrate protection efficacy in a randomized trial in the TAVR protection. But it trended that way, but the confidence intervals were so wide. So I think it's not something we should incorporate into trials as an endpoint. I think that would be highly problematic for a lot of reasons, yeah.
Bill, nice presentation and congratulations again. I think we talked about this a little bit last year about a 3-in-1 type catheter, all of these things that deliver. Has there been any iterative processes or things that you've learned, or is this fairly straightforward, ease of deployment, all of this. When we talked about adding things to catheters, sometimes it can become a little more challenging.
Yeah, actually, I think this is the opposite. If you look at the procedure itself, there's no exchanges required. There's not a lot of, kind of mischief you can get into during the procedure. So in many ways, I think it's not only faster, but also easier and less prone to error, to be honest with you. You're not going to lose sheaths in the aorta. You're not going to draw back a filter. That's just not going to happen because you're not doing a lot of exchanges.
Good. Well, thanks
Great.
very much for the outstanding presentation.